Hi, I'm Dr. Dee Blackie, and this is the story of how I developed Courage, a child protection community engagement program aimed at empowering individuals, families, and communities around the world. Child protection is the prevention and responding to violence, neglect, exploitation, and abuse against children. It is very important, as issues such as child abuse, neglect, and exploitation can lead to anxiety, depression, suicide, learning disorders, post-traumatic stress, and developmental challenges. In the long term, a life of violence can result in substance abuse, poor self-regulation, risky sexual behavior, and toxic stress that impacts negatively on a person's health and well-being. In the 90s and 2000s, I spent most of my time helping some amazing South African, and global brands to develop their visions. The problem is, when you introduce something new, even if it's an inspiring new vision, people get scared. Change is scary after all. So by default, in the process of developing all these inspiring visions, I had also become an expert in change management. In this, I was inspired by Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, a Swiss psychiatrist who studied how people grieve and identified a number of stages that people go through when they lose someone close to them. Any change is actually a loss and is experienced as this. So whether you lose a loved one, or you change your job, or your company gets bought out by a new brand, you are still going to go through these stages of change. When something new is happening that has a profound impact on you and your life, the first response is that of shock. I can't believe this has happened. Then we go into denial. I refuse to believe that this has happened. But slowly but surely it dawns on us that our world has changed, and we move into awareness and finally acceptance. The important point to note at this stage is that it's actually a very healthy phase, as we're moving from holding on to the past to letting go. The only problem is our confidence levels are really low. What does this mean for me? What does it mean for my job? How should I behave? As quickly as possible, a good change management process will get you to the phase of understanding and testing. This is what it means, this is how your job will change, and this is how you should behave. Finally, you move forward, and it's important to note that you will always be in a better position when you move forward, as people grow through change. So I set myself a challenge. I asked myself, what drives personal and community empowerment? And then I spent the next few years exploring this. Having read tons of books on personal empowerment, infinite possibility, leadership, and spiritual enlightenment, I noticed that the same 7 themes came up over and over again. Interestingly, they were the tools that I used in the world of branding. And the more I talked to people about them, the more I could tell when an organization and the people within it were empowered and when they were not. So these are what I call the empowerment tools of humanity, and it starts with what you believe in, your value system. It then looks at how you test those values through partnership and collaboration. It looks at how you build your self-esteem and self-worth and define your identity. It looks at how you bring people together through love and harmony, as opposed to pushing people apart. It looks at how you create a vision and a purpose for yourself. It looks at how you build on that through knowledge and insight. And finally, it looks at how you turn that into reality through presence and action. As the picture illustrates, if you want to grow a tree in the future, today you have to plant a seed. And this is how I explain it to people. To build personal and community empowerment, you need 3 things. The first is you need to believe in possibility. Is this possible or isn't it? Secondly, you need some level of self-awareness. So who am I? What am I good at? Where do I need help? And finally, you need to do this in the context of abundance versus scarcity. So scarcity says, there's not enough for everyone in the world, and to get more, I'm going to have to take it away from you. Abundance says there's more than enough for everyone in the world, and we've just got to be smart about how we use our resources. And so this became my new approach to business and brand engagement, but it also became my approach to personal and community empowerment. And basically what it argued was that when we are young, we often start off being quite unconsciously empowered. We believe we can do anything, we can be anything, and the world is our oyster. And then people come into our lives and they say, actually, no, you can't do anything and you can't be anything because of the color of your skin or because of your religion or because of your age or education or lack of education. And so very quickly we go from being unconsciously empowered to being unconsciously disempowered. So now we neither believe things are possible and we still don't know that much about ourselves and who we are and what we're good at and what we're not so good at. And interestingly, the people who create this group of unconscious disempowered individuals are the consciously disempowered. So these are the people who are actually quite smart. They know what they're doing, but they're all about scarcity. So there's never enough. And it's much better for them to keep you unconsciously disempowered than to actually help empower you. And obviously where we want to be is consciously empowered and in the space of abundance. So we need to build our self-awareness through defining our values, through partnering with people and testing those values, and through building our self-worth and self-esteem through defining our identity. And to build possibility, we need to define a vision for ourselves and a purpose. We need to build on that through knowledge and insight, and then we need to make that happen through action. And the way to do this in the context of abundance is through love and harmony and togetherness and community. So at the time of doing all this business and brand consulting, I was also going through quite a lot of personal grief and profound change. I have 2 beautiful children, but I also struggled with having 7 miscarriages and the last one leaving me infertile and struggling with postpartum depression. I decided to take a break from consulting in 2010 and spend some time with my family and my children. And it was World Cup here in South Africa. So we had a wonderful time making makarapas and learning the disky dance and blowing our vuvuzelas and watching soccer. And it was about 20 days after the final whistle blew for the World Cup, where I saw in a local newspaper a picture of a newborn baby girl who'd been abandoned on a rubbish heap on the outskirts of a rather large township where I live in Johannesburg. And I was absolutely heartbroken. I decided to contact some child protection organizations that I'd worked with in the past, and I asked them what's going on. And they were absolutely in despair. They told me that in the past they used to have 1 or 2 babies abandoned into their care every month. But now in 2010, they were seeing 4 or 5 children being abandoned into their care every single week, and they had a real problem they needed to deal with. So I decided to roll up my sleeves and get involved in the child protection community, and this started with the formation of a National Adoption Coalition for South Africa. And why adoption, you may ask? Well, when you find a child who's been abandoned on a street corner or in a taxi rank or in the open veld, you're not going to be able to track down their biological family. So the best long-term outcome for that child is to be adopted into a loving home where they can be cared for and where they can belong. We had 2 points of contact. There was the adoption side, which was all about adding adoption as an option of growing your family. And on the other side, Choose to Care, which was about trying to help women to choose to formally place their children into adoption rather than abandoning their child. We also did a lot of community engagement with a range of community maps developed by Trainiac. And these really looked at what are the causes of child abandonment and crisis pregnancy, and also the need to adopt and to build your family through the process of adoption. We had posters around option counseling for unplanned pregnancy. We had posters explaining how to get a child into the child protection system. And we also had posters explaining the legal process of adoption. I also returned to university and did my master's thesis looking at the lived experience of child abandonment and trying to understand the cultural implications of child abandonment and adoption in South Africa within the context of African ancestral beliefs. So whilst presenting my master's research and my community engagement program at the Nordic Adoption Conference in 2013, I was approached by the Swedish Foundation for Children Without Parental Care and advised that because I'd made the material available for free, a lot of people were using this community engagement program, and not just for child neglect and abandonment, but also for child abuse and child exploitation. And would it be possible to actually develop a more holistic program that could be used to improve the gatekeeping function of child protection officers around the world? So this was quite a big ask, but I used a trusted business tool of segmentation to try and understand the world of child protection. And I decided to explore, well, who is this child? Who is the perpetrator? Who is this child protection officer? What's actually happening to children? What are the challenges taking place in the world? How are we intervening and how are we solving these problems? Where are these child protection challenges taking place? Is it in the home? Is it in the child protection system? Is it in the community? When is it happening? Is it happening when they are firstborn? Is it happening when they become toddlers? Is it happening when they reach school or puberty, or when they go out into the world as young adults? And most importantly, why is it happening? Why are people abusing, neglecting, and exploiting children? This gave me a number of insights into the child protection community and how children and child protection challenges were being managed. And the first was that in many instances, the child protection solution was based on the problem. So you might have a nutrition solution, or you might have an education solution, or you might have a child trafficking solution. And what was missing was, can we place the child at the center of those solutions and say, what's happened in this child's life? So maybe they were abandoned at birth, they may be trafficked into the sex industry, they may be HIV positive, they've never eaten a decent meal, they've never been to school. How are we building a child protection process around that particular child's challenges? The second insight is that all forms of child protection challenges are based on some form of disempowerment within a community. So I realized that when I was trying to explore why do people abuse, neglect, or exploit children, often the reason they give is the opposite of the empowerment drivers that I'd identified in my personal empowerment process. So instead of values, you find violence and inequality. And instead of partnership, you find isolated individuals who are then exploited. Instead of high self-esteem, you find low self-esteem. Instead of love and togetherness and community, you find hate and anger and disconnection. Instead of having a vision and purpose, you find apathy and often addiction. Instead of having knowledge and insight, you find ignorance and often corruption. And instead of taking action, you find inaction and neglect. So what was really interesting was the sense of disempowerment had actually infiltrated how we do child protection. Within child protection, we have three kinds of people. So you've got your child protection officer, who is your teacher or your doctor or your nurse or your social worker or your community leader. You've got children, who could be anything from babies to teenagers to young adults. And then, of course, you've got your perpetrator, who could be a stranger, but very often that perpetrator is within the child's home. So the challenge is in the child protection community, the child protection officer who becomes disempowered becomes a rescuer. They're there to save the child. This immediately makes the child a victim, and the perpetrator becomes a persecutor. And the challenge is that tends to go round and round in circles. So rescuer becomes victim, becomes persecutor, becomes rescuer in a sort of drama triangle. And obviously what we then need to do is say, well, how do we then do child protection in an empowered way? So how do we make that child protection officer an enabler of change? How do we make the child a survivor or thriver of what they've been through? And how do we make that perpetrator an accountable person who knows the difference between right and wrong? The final insight was that this was a massive change management project that spanned individuals, families, communities, and society at large. Finding out that someone in your community or your family has raped or abused a child is as much of a shock as losing somebody close to you. We go through those same stages of change. We go through shock, I can't believe this has happened. Sometimes we go into denial. Well, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe the child is telling stories. But then, of course, more evidence comes to light and we become aware of the problem, and eventually we accept that this has taken place. And so what we need to do is then move our family or community into understanding, why did this happen? Testing, how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And finally moving forward. So the question was, how do we do this? And how do we do this in an empowered way? So in this, I was inspired by Lego, or having a kit of parts or different kinds of blocks that you could put together to create a solution for each individual community that you engage with. And the solution would be dependent on what you find within that community. From a branding perspective, I position Courage as an ingredient brand, which means it only operates inside other child protection organizations. It relies on those child protection officers to take the solution to the community. And when I was doing my research, I asked a lot of child protection officers, if you could take a pill that helps you to do what you do better, whether you're a police officer or a social worker or a teacher or a nurse, what would be in that pill? And most of those individuals said to me, we need some form of courage because the work that we're dealing with is so traumatic. So what does this look like in practice? How do we make it practical so that we can implement it in any community around the world? The Courage Toolkit is made up of 4 A1 large PVC posters that communities can gather around and discuss. There's 2 packs of cards, and then there's a very simple Train the Trainer poster. The first poster looks at how a child should be growing up, so their rights and needs. The second one looks at what's actually showing up in a community in different places and spaces. Then there's a poster that looks at how we move from disempowered to empowered child protection. And finally, a poster that looks at the legal approach to child protection and safeguarding. The 2 packs of cards, the one is a disempowerment pack that looks at every single child protection challenge and what it is, as well as the 7 disempowerment drivers, and an empowerment pack that then looks at children's rights and what's linked to those rights in terms of responsibilities, the developmental stages, and the empowerment drivers. So all courage processes start with some kind of a visioning process. If it's with community members and parents, we ask, what kind of world would you like to create for your children? If the workshop is with children, we ask, what kind of world would you like to create for yourselves, or would you like to live in? As stimulus input, we share children's rights as defined by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child, UNICEF's Rights and Needs of the Child, the African Union's Rights and Needs of the Child, and our own South African Constitution. From a developmental perspective, we illustrate how children should grow up from in utero all the way through their first few years of life, and then all the way through to being teenagers and young adults. This is actually an example from the Seychelles, where the National Council for Children actually got the whole of the Seychelles to get together and define the kind of world they would like to create for children in the Seychelles. And this is an example of where we've done a workshop with children and asked them actually to define their ideal community, complete with a community name that represents the kind of world they'd like to live in. The next step is to identify which child protection challenges are actually taking place within their communities. So we literally give participants a poster and we say, have a look at this poster, and based on these different child protection challenges, the kinds of people you find within the community and the different spaces and places, what are some of the child protection challenges happening here? So this is an example of a group of psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses who are identifying what some of the challenges were showing up in their community of mental health within Johannesburg. And this is a close-up of the community map, and you can sort of see examples here of problems such as drug and alcohol abuse, of child abuse within the home, or crisis pregnancy, and how that shows up. There are 48 unique child protection cards in the Disempowerment card pack, and what we ask community members to do is to actually go through each of these cards and identify, is this challenge happening within your community? And if it is happening, is this a high, a medium, or a low priority in terms of your community? And they then create these 4 different piles, which then helps them not only to understand what the challenge is, but to prioritize it in terms of how they want to solve it as a community. This is the example of a late termination of pregnancy card. So it has a little picture that illustrates what the challenge might look like. It has an icon, and then it also talks to what are some of the things that you need to be aware of in terms of what this challenge is all about. Participants discuss each challenge within the context of their community and decide what sort of impact it's going to have on their community should they be able to solve this challenge. What is very revolutionary about this program is its systematic approach to an empowered theory of change. So participants get to identify these are the challenges that we're looking at. So say it's exposure to gangsterism or it's drug and alcohol abuse. They then ask themselves, how is this showing up in our community? And from that, they're able to identify the disempowerment driver causing this challenge in their community. And we then ask them to use the opposite empowerment driver to solve that child protection challenge. So what we're teaching participants in this child protection process is an empowered approach to solving problems. Identify what the problem is, identify what's causing that problem in the context of your community, and then solve that problem using an empowered versus a disempowered approach. This is an example from a workshop I ran with children in the inner city of Johannesburg who identified that their teacher was emotionally abusing them by screaming and shouting at them in class. They came up with an idea of an in-class campaign which was called Love Your Teacher and Your Teacher Would Love You. So they went to their teacher and said, we want to love you, and we're going to show this love by doing our work, by arriving on time, by respecting you as a teacher. But then we need you as a teacher to show us love by treating us well and not calling us stupid and helping us to learn. We then take participants through a very pragmatic step-by-step approach to solving child protection challenges. So what is the legal approach in terms of the law of what you should do if you've seen a child or you know of a child who's being abused or neglected or exploited? And what would the solution then be for that child in that process? One of the most important things to remember in child protection is that no person is an island. And so what we also use the community map for is to identify who are the partners in our community that we can work with to ensure good child protection and empower child protection, and how should we be working with them to ensure a win-win relationship. So here you can see some graduates from Northwest University who are using the map to identify all of the partners they should be working with in the community to solve child protection challenges. And here is an example of two child protection partners who at the beginning of a workshop didn't want to talk to each other, but by the end of the workshop really understood what their joint goal was in protecting children, and had developed a very strategic plan on how to work with each other to solve those child protection challenges. Towards the end of the workshop, we returned to that vision statement of the kind of world we'd like to create for our children, or for the children, the kind of world they'd like to create for themselves. And we started with looking at rights and responsibilities. So, for instance, you may have a right to education, but your responsibility is to work hard and to learn and to focus on your studies. We then say, okay, so then from this, what are the values that we need to live to ensure that we achieve our vision statement? So if the right is about education and the responsibility is about working hard, the value is about valuing a learning community, for instance. The final step in a Courage Community workshop is defining an action plan. And so we ask people, based on what you've learned today in this workshop, what are the things you want to stop doing? What are the things you want to start doing? And importantly, what are the things that you're already doing as a community that you would like to keep doing? So I've been running this child protection process with this child protection toolkit since 2015 around the world, and reached more than 5,000 community members over those 9 years. So you can find all of this Courage content, the tools that you need, the posters and print files that you need, as well as videos explaining how to run the various exercises at www.courage-community.com. You can download it all for free and hopefully start running Courage Community workshops in your community with your child protection officers. Thank you for your time and attention. Stay strong and take courage.